Life Issues with Vicky Gibbens on UCB One.
For more than 70 years, those living with an impairment have competed on an international sporting stage. It started with the International Stoke Mandeville Games, which later became the Paralympic Games. It's not only about individual sporting achievements, but using it as a platform to aid understanding about disability and change wider society's attitudes. Yet, around the world, disabled people are still at high risk of poverty and frequently excluded from education, training and employment opportunities. As a Paralympian, how do you use your status to promote inclusivity everywhere and in all circumstances, to see all people thrive? I'm Vicky Gibbens, and for UCB's Life Issues today, we're joined by British Paralympic long jumper and sprinter, Stef Reid MBE. That seems the simplest introduction, Stef. It's perhaps quicker to say what you don't do because you're accomplishing so many different roles these days. I mean, what do you identify most with at the moment?
Oh, do you know what? That is a great question. I've had this policy in my life where I like saying yes to things. I really love, I find learning things like really exciting and really stimulating. And I also I don't ever want to miss out on any opportunity, and you don't know until you try. But I think probably the signatures or the hallmarks, if you kind of look at how my life has gone and the things that I tend to say yes to, one, if it's really hard, I'm in. But the other thing I feel like I've just been developing it more and more over the course of my life is just this, the skill of communication. I love communicating with people in all its forms. And I think possibly the older you get, the more you realize how difficult it actually is to be able to convey ideas, to get people on board, to inspire them, to help them to understand their perspective and yours. And I don't know if it's just kind of coincided with perhaps sometimes what I see is the deterioration in communication with social media and these quick little snippets. Oh, you can't communicate an idea in 240 characters. It's this lifetime of listening. So I think, okay, those are the two hallmarks. So things that are really hard and things that involve listening and communicating ideas.
It's fascinating to hear you say that, given that all you've achieved, you've been world champion, 4-time Paralympian, you've got a fair few world records to your name as well. I mean, when it comes to top performing sports stars, many get recognised by the public, not only because of their achievements, but perhaps because of the commercial deals, the brand, the ads that go alongside them. Did you find you kind of got that recognition after your sporting achievements as a Paralympian, or did you find appearing on Dancing on Ice back in 2022 actually change things more?
Do you know what? I've had such an interesting journey with this, world of sponsorships and I'm doing air quotes, celebrity. When I first came to the UK and made a permanent move, people listening, you'll probably flag my accent's a little bit unusual, and that's just because I grew up in lots of different places, and I was in a position where I held 3 different passports. So when I first started competing for the UK, I came over fully under the impression that no one's going to like me commercially. This is a no-go. I have the wrong accent. People will think, oh, she's just, an outsider. So I came over fully prepared that, okay, I'm probably going to have to work. My background's in biochemistry, and I'm thinking, oh, like, what on earth am I going to pick that's going to be able to combine that with full-time training? And it was actually the complete opposite. I was so lucky that I came in and I had some wonderful sponsors from the start. And one of the best ways that I found to supplement my income supplement what I was doing with sport was actually through speaking. It was something that I could control in the sense of I can control my schedule. It wasn't a 9 to 5. And so my experience with that was actually really positive. And I had some wonderful sponsors. People are surprised when I tell them in parasports, in Paralympics, that there isn't prize money. So we're doing all of these things. The only way to be the best in the world is to train as though it's your full-time job, and yet you're not actually paid to do it. And so you just think, how on earth do you make this work? And fortunately, with UK sports, we do have a system where athletes do receive support. But this is not a plan for retirement. This is just enough money to allow you to do what you need to do. And then on top of that, especially in parasport, you have to consider the equipment. My prosthetic legs are very expensive. Racing wheelchairs are very expensive. So from that sense, sponsorship was always going to be a huge part of the equation. But then you kind of move along your career and you have to start making decisions about well, how far do I want to go down this road? And so we now have this new term called an influencer. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And I dabbled with it a little bit. And to be honest, I'm probably like the worst celebrity ever. Like I don't enjoy that world very much. And I kind of dabbled. I am on social media a lot. I love making reels, but I love making them for me. And sometimes I would think about perhaps working with a company, and I just thought, but it was never my dream to be a marketer. Like I haven't done all of this to market your product, which, honestly, I wouldn't even know about had you not told me about it a week ago. And so you just kind of have to make these decisions as you go down through your career and in terms of credibility. And I want to have a voice. I want to have an opinion that matters. I want to think deeply about things. And every time you have to be careful what you take on because you are almost selling, in a sense, an element of your authority. And so it better be something you believe in. So that's just something I've been quite conscious of as my career has progressed in the past 20 years.
I mean, how have you navigated it all and the life choices you've made? Because as you said before, you studied, biochemistry. There was this medical influence as part of your life. Sport, a huge significant part as well. I know you were passionate about rugby. Do you come from a sporting family? I mean, what's your background there?
Not really, actually. So I loved sport growing up. It was one of my favorite things. But my parents were so strict in the sense that there was no way sport was going to dominate our lives. They both came from working class background. I don't think they would describe it as difficult, but it definitely wasn't privileged in that sense. And they just never had the opportunity to go to university or do anything down that route. And they were just so committed from the start that education is the foundation for everything. So, and my parents actually were sporty. My mom is a great athlete. She just grew up in an era when it wasn't really common for women to play sports. My dad was a great footballer, but again, he came from an era where nobody makes money playing football. That's ridiculous. Get a real job type thing. So it just never really was a thing for them. And my brother and sister, they're both talented athletes. But I really was the only one that took it on professionally in that sense. But the rule initially in school was my parents were very supportive, but they said you can play sports in school. We're not driving you, up and down the country on weekends to compete. The focus needs to be on your education.
And I wonder if that actually has helped you along the way in terms of if you want to do sport, then actually the ownership is kind of on you.
You know what? It is one of the things I have been so thankful about my family. Everyone's family is different. And I've read a lot of different biographies, and I've witnessed a lot of situations where it's very clear that the parent is either the coach or just really, really invested in it. And my family was just the total opposite. They're fantastic. They will show up to every single event. They will fly all over the world and they will cheer, but they don't really care about, I've always known my parents, they don't care about the finish. Their biggest concern is, Stephanie, are you happy afterwards? And sometimes it's really frustrating. I'll come and I'll be in a foul mood because I'd had a rough time. My mom would be like, I don't understand why you're so angry. I'm like, Mom, I just came in seventh. It was awful. Oh, but honey, you look so beautiful doing it. And I'm like, oh my goodness, come on, Mom. But that was just, that was a thing. And actually that's nice because I never once felt like I had to compete in a way to impress them or make them love me more. And having that clear separation actually was so healthy for me.
I imagine it gave you immense security as well. Thinking about the UK context, there are 16 million disabled people in the UK. Impairments can be physical, sensory, intellectual, psychosocial, and they can happen from birth or develop later in life. What's that been like for you from being able-bodied to then living with an artificial foot?
I think that's a really important distinction that you make there, and that where a disability comes in someone's life does have a huge impact in terms of the psychology around it. And I think actually it was my mum's description of it, and this is from her as a parent, in terms of the difficulty. I was 15 when I was in an accident just before my 16th birthday, and I lost part of my right leg. And it was just listening to my mum's description of everybody was celebrating these milestones of, oh, amazing, look at Stephanie run now. And she described it as sometimes feeling this pressure to be really happy about it. But she was just like, but like had I been born like this and this was my first step, that's different. That's a step forward. But in many ways, she's like, but I watched you as a child run and win these races. And she always had, as a parent, I'm watching this comparison and everybody thinks this is a step forward. And yet, for many ways, it's not a step forward. It's just a step trying to get back to where you were. And so, and I understood that. And that was part of the difficulty when I went back to playing rugby. I loved rugby as a child growing up, but the accident happened and I went back to play it and I didn't enjoy it anymore. And I didn't enjoy it because I was no longer the same athlete. I wasn't as agile. I wasn't as fast. And if people see me, I'm quite small. That was my asset. I was quick and I could move. And once that was taken away, I just didn't enjoy it. And so there very much, for me, had to be the separation between the person I was and the person I am now, because otherwise that comparison is just going to destroy you and take away all of that joy. You just have to put a mark in the sand and say, right, that person in effect is no longer here. And I think that's part of the reason why they describe it as a grieving process. You are grieving for that life that you no longer have. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be a sad thing, but you do have to grieve and honor it. The new life can still be awesome, but it will be different.
So remind us, where were you in the world at this point? Obviously, emergency care was the priority, but then what kind of support did you then have?
So I was born in New Zealand. My parents are British and they immigrated to Toronto, Canada when I was 4. So I grew up in Canada and that's where I was when the accident happened. And so the healthcare system in Canada has a lot of similarities to the US, or sorry, has a lot of similarities to the UK, not the US, in the sense that there is universal healthcare for everyone. And I was so lucky that just the way things played out, I ended up with one of the best orthopedic surgeons in the country who happened to be working on the exact technique that I needed to help close up some of those propeller wounds, which were quite messy. And then, yes, as you say, step number 1, you need to save the life. But step number 2 is you need to build that life. And what's involved there was a whole new world of artificial legs and learning how to walk and figuring this out. And again, I was really lucky that in Canada, they do have this amazing association called the War Amps. And it is a legacy from veterans that fought in World War I and World War II. And a lot of them came back and they were missing limbs. And so they needed to find these different ways to support them. As the years went on, the veterans realized, we don't really have veterans with coming back with amputations from war anymore, because it's a relatively peaceful time. And so they shifted their focus to children in Canada. And basically, if you were under the age of 18, you can apply and have your artificial legs funded. And for me, I was so lucky simply because I have always had access to funding and to technology. Life for me would look very, very different if I didn't have the artificial legs that I do.
Do you think age was a factor in terms of when you became an amputee compared to when you hear of other people's experiences and different stages of life and having an impairment? I
do think it gets more difficult as you get older. And maybe I think it's just part of human nature. I think for whatever reason, change sometimes is more difficult to adapt to the older we are, and we have to work really, really hard at it. I was in quite a weird space in that I was 15, 16, not quite an adult, but quite far along, old enough to have identified a big portion of my life as an able-bodied person, and then acquiring a disability. I've met amputees that have, happened later in life in their 50s and 60s. And apart from the psychological aspect, it's just the physical aspect where I've said it a few times, people look at me and think I'm crazy, but the moment you acquire a disability, a physical disability, you don't really have an option. You have to become an athlete in a sense, because even just you think about the physical coordination it takes to walk with an artificial leg, or if you become a wheelchair user, if you want to have independence, you have to be able to self-transfer with just your arms. Both of those acts are really, really difficult, and you'd have to work really hard. And so, yeah, those two things combined, the physical nature and the mental aspect, I do think it's easier the younger you are.
What about other people's impressions, expectations of you? Has that changed as the years have gone by? What's the most common response you still get?
I I think the interesting thing has been seeing the evolution of the different responses. So I was injured in 2000. So this is 24 years now. I've got a wealth of experience. And I've definitely seen a shift, which is super exciting because people talk a lot about, oh, cultural change takes forever. Actually, 20 years is not long. And I've seen huge changes. So I think initially it was always just, oh, that's really sad. Look at her. And then, well, especially in this country, we had the London 2012 Paralympics, and I think that created a huge mindset shift in a lot of people. And for me, when people ask, you'll see a lot of negative stuff in the media about legacy and, oh, it didn't really change anything. And I disagree. Fine. I wasn't involved in the surveys and the research. I can only speak from what I experienced. But I remember about 3 months after the London 2012 Paralympics happened, and I was just in I wasn't in my high performance gym. I just went to my local gym because I was having a bit of a break. I remember squatting squatting is when you have weights on your back and you're bringing your body down and working your legs. And these two gentlemen who probably were in their early 20s, they came over and they said, oh, you're squatting a lot. Can you give us some advice? And I just thought, my goodness, the fact that these two young men have come over and asked not only a female, like a girl, but somebody with an artificial leg for advice, I thought, if that's not change, I don't know what is. But okay, so you've got that extreme, but then you have the extreme of things that I still experience on a regular basis sometimes. And a few months ago, I was at the skating rink and I was changing my legs, which I'm at the point now where that's fine for me. I don't mind doing it in public. This is, it's just what I do to get on with my life. And as I was changing them, I was aware of, I don't know if it was a mom or a grandma, but she was there with her daughter who would have been, I don't know, 3 or 4. And she stopped in front of me and said, look, sweetie, let's watch this lady as she changes her legs. And I was a bit taken aback by it. And it's not that I mind somebody watching, but it was just, I just couldn't believe that she didn't address me first and just said, hi, I'm here with my daughter. Do you mind if we watch? And I just had this really uncomfortable experience of, I just kind of felt like, I don't know, somebody was watching me in a zoo and, watch her do this really weird thing. And I know the intent was they wanted that to be a positive experience for their child, but actually for me it was quite dehumanizing, and so I think we still kind of have these different tensions, and I bring that up only because I speak quite a bit in the space of diversity and inclusion. And so often people come in and they expect training on, okay, what is the latest politically correct words that we need to use? And I'm like, honestly, they change all the time. I don't even know them. But all you need to know, it's so simple. Just treat people with dignity and respect. That's it. It doesn't matter if they're disabled or able-bodied. It's simply the same for everybody. It's incredibly simple, and you don't need to be scared about weighing into that space. You'll be fine if you do just that.
And I know you've spoken about this before as well, the idea of asking people what's happened, why they have an impairment. For you, obviously, your story is trauma related and people don't always respect that.
It's a really tricky one. There is no hard and fast rule on this. Every person is different in terms of whether or not they want to share their story. I'm different depending on what day you catch me on. So, sometimes I'm in an emotional space and I have the time where I'm happy to share it. Other times I'm simply not. And it's thank you for recognizing that. Every time I share that story, I go back to, I don't know how to tell it without reliving it. And so I'm having to relive it every single time. And sometimes I just don't have the space, or I'm making a split-second decision between, is this something that potentially, you need to hear right now, or are you just feeling a bit curious? And I have to say, I don't ever want to discourage somebody from going up and asking a genuine question. I've had some amazing conversations by people who were brave enough to come up and ask. And that's the key thing. They asked. They didn't expect or demand it. They asked. And, as I've shared my story and then asked a few questions after, I've discovered, oh, this woman's son is contemplating having an amputation. And so it changes every single time. But I think what I would recommend is that there is an emotional tool for everybody asking that question. And it's always important that you approach it as a request, fully recognizing they have the right to say no, and that's okay too.
You mentioned that idea of experiences feeling dehumanizing. Within politics and the media, disability can often be presented as a health issue or a human rights issue. What problems can that bring to wider society's understanding?
I think sometimes disability so often gets portrayed in this negative aspect. It's this burden on society that we need to deal with. And I find that really frustrating. And that's part of the reason why, as much as possible, I like to stay away from the categories of able-bodied and disability, because it just reinforces that message that there's a big divide, and there's not. There are simply humans. And when it comes to high performance, and when I say high performance, I simply mean getting the best of every single person out of our workforce. The rules and the strategy is exactly the same. It is simply about providing an environment for someone to reach their full potential. And for a lot of people, that can be as simple as just making sure there is an alternative route into the building that doesn't involve stairs, because somebody in a wheelchair can't do that. There are different circumstances for everybody. Maybe if it comes to you have an employee who happens to be a single mom, it's about flexible work options for them. The solution for each person, yes, looks different, but the main heart of it, allowing every single person to reach their full potential, that is the same across the board. And that is why every single person should care about this. You don't have to have a disability to care about disability politics. You don't have to know someone. And the reason I say that is because, again, disability is not a divider. Disability is a spectrum, and every single one of us is on it. And throughout our lives, we are going to move across that spectrum. And that's the reality. And that's why, whether or not you're disabled now, you should still care about disabled politics, because actually how, as a society, we treat the most vulnerable amongst us, that makes a huge statement about who we are as people and what's going to happen when we're struggling. And I really, really want to live in a world and in a country where we take care of each other.
You say this idea about everyone living to their full potential. I wonder, is that also, how does faith colour that perspective?
When I first had that accident, and I was very aware how close I was to not making it, to dying. And then I was saved. And I have no doubt in my mind that, okay, fine, it doesn't meet the theological definition of miracle, but it was a miracle that I survived. And on the one hand, I was really angry, because it was like, well, awesome, I've survived. Thanks a lot, God, but you've taken away the one thing that I loved. It just seemed really cruel in a way. And I thought, I don't want this life. And on the other side of that, I thought, well, look, I cannot deny that my life was saved in a miraculous way. And there's no reason why God would save my life unless there was still something that I had to accomplish. Like, there still has to be something out there for me. And I think for me, that's kind of where this idea of faith comes in, and in particular Christian faith. And that isn't, just for me, that's for everybody. We are all on this earth for a reason. And, God has blessed all of us with these different giftings, and he's put us in different situations. And I do very much think that our role is to use everything he's given us, to use that context and change our little microcosm of the world that's around us. I sometimes think, no, like it's too, changing the world is too big. That's for God. But what I can do is I can change the world around me. And even when you look at businesses as they stand now, where we are with technology, we don't need people because of the things that they can do. Businesses need people because of who they are. And the actual people in a business is where the the value is. And so I do just think it really matters that we're taking care of the people, making sure that they are able to develop fully in every area that is required to be a great human. And that's why this matters. And the faith part comes in that God created every single person. God's image is in every single person. Nobody is a write-off. There is potential inside of every single one of us.
A moment ago, you mentioned the London Games. And as you put it, human beings, thousands of them, are going to be taking part in the Paralympics. I know it's going to be the first games for you. It must be strange not being there in Paris come August. But the idea that some of the language that comes out around the Paralympics, inspiring, resilient athletes' adaptability, is that helpful, or is it a bit of a misrepresentation when you hear of the everyday experiences? I've heard reports recently of needing accessibility of taxi ranks still not happening with lower curbs. I've heard of special needs schools, pressure of closure due to funding issues. I know you shared a brilliant social video recently on socials of just trying to buy a pair of shoes. Like, how much is there a difference between we've got millions of people, living with impairments and the reality then of what we see on the world stage at the Paralympics?
There is still, you're right, a huge disconnect. And just because you are seeing people with disability excelling in one arena at the Paralympics does not mean that they are experiencing that type of support in their everyday lives. But I still think this is part of the change. Seeing people competing at this world-class sporting events, and I look at it and I just think, I bet these were the same kids that everybody looked over in gym class. They were probably the ones picked last for teams, and they're the least likely you expect to become athletes. And actually, given the right context and the right support, my goodness, look at what they can do. And yes, I appreciate that there are still quite a lot of practical things that need to happen, like accessible cities all over the place. But I'm still filled with hope, because it starts with changing people's hearts and people's minds. Once you do that, then I think the practicalities and the decisions follow. But this is our first port of call. And I personally, I don't take offense when people refer to Paralympians as inspirational. As long as we're also acknowledging that they're not inspirational simply for existing. They're inspirational because of the work that they've put in. There's a big difference. But I think it's a compliment, and I know that not every athlete feels that way. Again, I'm not being a spokesperson, but I will actually answer that from a broadcaster's perspective, because I now have started working as a broadcaster, and it is one of the conversations that we have. How do we find that balance between telling the athlete's story and just leaving it with the sport? Personally, I think that we're doing a disservice to Paralympians if we just talk about their sport, because one, it's part of the story, but two, let's say I'm broadcasting for the Olympics and the Paralympics. Now, why do I want to watch a Paralympian run 100 meters in 11 seconds if I can watch an Olympian run 100 meters in 9.5? You have to give them a reason. And for me, the reason is the story. And to me, that's the power, because ultimately human beings are moved by stories, not numbers.
And what do you make of UK sports wanting all those involved competing in the Summer's Games to actually win well? The idea of well-being now being considered as much as whether we're bringing home the gold, the silver or the bronze.
Okay, the truth is I'm torn on that one. And it is a conversation that I've been having a lot. And I'm always someone that, yes, I will look at what you're saying, but I'm far more interested in how you spend your time and how you spend your money. So, and what I mean by that is, okay, yeah, it's awesome that you are focusing on well-being, but actually, where does your funding policy still lie? You're not funding athletes for displaying great well-being. You're still funding athletes for medals. So for me, it's a message that isn't quite joined up, and that's okay, because I also think the thinking behind this still needs to go through a bit more evolution, and it's a question. Can I'm not convinced that you can be a world champion or be the best at anything without being just a little bit off. And by a little bit off, I just mean you're not going to have a normal life, because you can't have a normal life and be the best in the world. And so you are, and I found this in my life, you're constantly having to make choices, and there will always be something different about somebody that is quote unquote at the top. And I think for me, the most important thing is not trying to live your life as though you're trying to achieve a normal goal. It's about recognizing that you've had choices in this and that you have chosen this, and you're recognizing that actually you can't have it all. That's a lie. You can't. You have to make choices, and you have to make good ones, and you have to be fully aware of when you say yes to something, it's an automatic no to something else. So, as you can tell by my rambling, I've not quite yet sussed all of this out. I'm glad this conversation is happening, but I still think there's a lot of mixed messaging that's going on. And now we're saying, yes, we want you to have amazing well-being, but actually our funding structure doesn't quite support that. And so you think, okay, now where do I sit within that, and what do I value?
It's going to be interesting to see how it evolves and, as you say, how the conversation develops. Stef, you've mentioned you're a motivational speaker, you're a broadcaster, you're still on the ice rink. How did you end up becoming vice president of the leprosy mission?
This was just one of the most amazing coincidences ever. I mean, I literally got a call out of the blue inviting me to come to Nepal. And it just so happened that it must have been about 2 days prior, I had been watching Doctor Strange. My husband's really into Marvel. I'm not. And he went to Nepal, for healing. I remember sitting here thinking, that'd be really cool, to go to Kathmandu. 2 days later, I got a call, and I was like, yeah, I'm in. And they're like, what? You don't even know us. You're going to come to Nepal? I'm like, yes, I'm totally in. And the reason we were going was because we were doing a social media fundraiser. They have an amazing leprosy hospital. One of the flagship hospitals, Anandaman Hospital, which is just outside of Kathmandu, and it had been hit by an earthquake. And they've still been managing and still been doing their best, but at the time they were actually doing these incredible surgeries in a tent because they couldn't use their building because it had some cracks in the foundation. And so, and the connecting factor was leprosy, if left untreated, will often result in long-term disability, either through amputation of one of your limbs or the fact that you just can't use it anymore. And as I didn't know anything about leprosy when I first started. I fell into all the stereotypes. Leprosy, is it even still around? Guys, just checking, like, am I going to get leprosy if I go? They're like, no, it's actually not contagious. It's not that contagious. It's a little bit contagious, but it's not crazily contagious. And actually, you won't contract it unless you are living in poverty and that you're malnourished.
And it's treatable.
Yes, and it's 100% curable. It's a really simple cure and a really effective cure. And so all these things that I thought about it ended up not to be true at all. But what I didn't fully appreciate was just the level of discrimination that you experience as somebody with leprosy. And it was just, the moment you discover you have it, when you need your community, that's the moment where everybody basically turns their back on you. And it was just, again, it's this disease where cancer doesn't discriminate. You can have, all sorts of money, you can be super famous, you can still get cancer. Leprosy is a disease that only shows up in the poorest, most forgotten parts of the world. That's why it never has a spokesperson. It's never had that famous person whose life it really touched. Well, I say that apart, Princess Diana, who we have those amazing photos of her embracing patients with leprosy while photographers took photos behind glass screens. But this doesn't normally happen because it's just this forgotten population. And that's just what really shocked me. And I just thought, this is not okay. And actually, how many of the problems in the world and in our country right now happen because of this exact issue. It's just discrimination and poverty. And if we can find a solution here, then there are so many other things that we can find a solution for elsewhere in the world.
Do you see that one day we will eventually have an end to leprosy?
I think so. I think there's still a little bit of uncertainty in terms of kind of how it is it in the ground, how it gets passed along. However, there will be an end in its long-term effects because people won't be embarrassed. People will be educated. They'll know the signs. They won't be embarrassed to come forward and say, "Hey, I need looking at this patch on my skin. This is a medicine." The effects of leprosy will definitely end.
Stef, where would you want to leave people today, having heard this conversation, thinking about the games in the summer, what they'll be watching, what they're receiving, but also just their day-to-day reality of who they are mixing with in society?
I think I'd want people to leave with an awareness that God has placed all of us exactly where we are in a context. And oftentimes, sometimes I love the context, and oftentimes I think, God, I don't want to be here. Like I choose somewhere else. But it's just thinking, well, actually, if I'm here, then there is a role that I can play, and maybe it's not about what I'm going to receive in this situation, but about what I can share. And I have had just such a wonderful life, wonderful because of the people I've been surrounded by and have invested in me and just helped me to develop. And so the message is exactly where you are right now is perfect for God and perfect for you to start exploring your potential and just using the gifts and experimenting. I've done lots of things in my life and made lots of choices, and I've got a lot of them wrong. And honestly, it's fine. You get it wrong, you say, okay, well, that didn't work out, and then you learn from it and try something else, and that's how the growth happens. It's not this amazing straight shot of perfection. It's kind of wallowing around in your mistakes and eventually finding a way out, and that's okay too. But we have huge potential to impact the world. And it's an exciting thing to wake up and think that, oh man, I can make a change today. And I just think that's a really fun way to live.
It's fascinating to hear you share that because so many of us, talk a lot about calling and wanting to feel that sense of security, but you seem to remain so open to wherever God is taking you next.
I've had so many instances in my, I am the kind of person that, yes, I always have a plan. And I have this very specific vision of what I want it to look like. And that's okay. And I think I'm never going to change. That's just me. That's just my personality. But the thing that I've learned is that I needed to start holding that loosely. And there have been so many times in my life when I've just had large periods where I've been angry at God. And, sometimes this has been over a year. It's not like this daily thing that gets fixed the next day, but, entire years where I've just been so angry with God and looking around and thinking like, why have you put these desires in my heart, God, if they're not going to be honored? Why does everybody else seem to be enjoying the things and the blessings that I wanted? And it's so frustrating to watch. But, I've just kind of I've always been honest with God about it. And I've just said, look, you probably know what I'm thinking anyway, so I'm just going to say it, even though it's probably not appropriate to say all these things to the creator of the world. Like this is the truth. But as I've just watched and I've committed, I'm like, I will see this out, but I'm not happy with it. And then you get to the end of it, and actually what God has led you to, it's not what I wanted. It's so much better. But you just have to, trust and see how things play out. And it's not a fast fix and it's not an easy fix. But I think I've walked long enough with God over a number of years to see that even though sometimes I can have a snapshot where I think this is awful, actually over the long term, he has never once let me down, and his vision has always been better than what I thought I wanted.
One thing I did want to incorporate was just thinking about just the practicalities of doing life and relationships, and of course being married to Brent and what that's been like.
Being married to Brent has been a challenge. I think a wonderful challenge. On paper, we just probably wouldn't work. We're so different in so many ways. And again, sometimes I'd be like, God, why on earth would you have me marry someone who's literally the exact opposite of me? And every single time I could just see him like, this is because he's perfect for you. He was the only choice. And God has always been right on that occasion. And Brent really is, we just celebrated our 15-year anniversary in October. And I got married quite young, actually. I was 23 and I had no plans to marry until I was 35. But you meet the person and that's it. And it's been really challenging because I think for starters, you just getting married that young. I mean, you change so much between your 20s and your 30s. And I sometimes think, oh, poor Brent, like the person he thought he was marrying ended up being somebody wildly different by my 30s. And so you have to really navigate that period and make space for each person to grow individually, but you also really have to make sure you're growing together, because otherwise you can find yourself in a scenario where you've both grown and you've not done that together and you just ended up on totally different paths. But the other really challenging thing was that we were both athletes, and athletes are, you have to be in a sense really selfish, and you basically spend your life asking permission of those closest to you to be that selfish, because you are so focused and everything revolves around this one goal. And there's a level of understanding. There comes a time when it's a bit much, and you have to step back and just kind of reevaluate things. But when you have two athletes in that relationship, and on the one hand we're both having to be super selfish, on the other hand I've made this vow, this commitment to supporting Brent, it's so hard to keep trying to assess where that line is between losing yourself but also being a good spouse. And so I've just found it's been so tricky, but it's definitely one of the places in my life where I've grown the most. And also I'm so thankful for the balance Brent has brought to my life in terms of balancing out my personality. And we really are just the perfect match. And I'm God definitely got that one right.
Do you think because of both your experiences, it helps when there are those barriers still within society, when you are facing discrimination, where there are incidents, because you both have a shared experience in some sense?
Yeah, I think we've had just some really funny moments, and again, you can just kind of see that those different attitudes. So I have not a strange disability, but I do have a weird disability in that it's not always obvious. If I have trousers on, nobody really knows I have an artificial leg. Whereas Brent, my husband, he uses a wheelchair, so his is always obvious. And so you'll just notice little things like we'll be at a restaurant, clearly on a date, and a date, we're married, whatever, we still date, on a date, and the waiter will hand me the bill. And I'm kind of like, I could understand if you put it in the middle of the table because we're a modern society, but you've handed me the bill. And it's just like, do you assume that people in wheelchairs don't have money? Or I'm like, first of all, I didn't even bring a wallet, so you're going to have to give it to Brent. But it's just, little things like that. They're just fascinating. And you just think, and it's not that I'm necessarily offended. I just think, okay, like what messaging are people still getting in society? Or they'll assume that Brent and I are, family members. Like do people with disabilities not, I don't know, get married or have relationships? They're people too. And so I've actually really, really enjoyed it. Or, if we're in the mall together and, seeing one person with disability is, crazy, and then you see two people just don't know where to look and they're fascinated. And so we've had a lot of fun with it, but I think it also empowers us. We know we're sometimes walking into scenarios where people will have expectations, but when there's two of you, you kind of have your person to back you up.
Stef, there are many ways I know that we can connect with you. Where's best to go to if people want to follow all that you're up to at the moment?
Do you know what? I'm on Instagram. That probably is the most common one. I do my absolute best to respond to messages. I'm sorry if I don't always get them, but please do stay in touch on Instagram. Run, jump, Stef Reid. You've asked some wonderful questions. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you for listening today. As we've been hearing from Stef, sporting achievements on a world stage doesn't mean daily life is free from challenge. We all have the opportunity to meaningfully engage with those living with a disability. It isn't something that has to be left to the government or individuals who have an impairment having to defend their rights. We all should be able to enjoy opportunities of education, work, transport and leisure activities. Good accessibility benefits everyone, as does being able to actively contribute and participate in community, church and society. My thanks also goes to Rebecca Smith for producing today's episode of UCB's Life Issues, and do make sure you subscribe to the series.